where the city wants to have more affordable housing, and so they'll say, look, you can build a 5-story building, but we'll let you build a 6-story building if you can prove it's going to be for affordable housing. So I get more units, I get more capacity, and the city gets more affordable housing. It's called an overlay, where it's not the basic zoning, it's this extra with this other issue. It could be if you provide open space, then we'll give you these other benefits, or a green roof, or something along those lines. Like, what is it that the city needs, and then what would make the life better for the developers, and how do you make those things become win-wins for everybody? Transit-oriented design would be an example of often used as an overlay zoning code, where it's that ability to say, look, we're going to have a different type of zoning right where the transit mark is, even though it won't say necessarily this is a different place on the zoning map. It's something that you would just know that within 600 feet or 500 feet or half a mile or a mile of this transit moment is going to have different zoning rules to it. Right, so it's this idea that there's the regular zoning and then there's this overlay. Other kinds of specialty zoning you could imagine, or specialty codes you could imagine. Imagine you are building a high-rise building and you're near an airport. Well, really, you're going to build a high-rise near the airport? Don't you see a potential problem with that? Planes hitting the building. So even though it may not say in the zoning code or in the building code that you can't build a high-rise there, there may be some other code and some sort of FAA mapping that says, there's limitations in the buildings in these locations. Another example would be like watershed issues. New York City rather famously has its watershed up in the Catskill Mountains, and so the whole Catskill Mountain area is considered the watershed, meaning that's where the drinking water comes from for all of New York City. So you're not allowed to build anything in the watershed that has toxic materials that would produce something that would damage the water system, because any small damage could have such a huge impact that it becomes this very important aspect. So it's not always just the building code and just the zoning code. Often there are these other specialty elements. And then there's some sort of subsets of the main codes. You might call them like the ADA codes or fire protection codes or something, which are specific issues and specific code documents, but they are referenced directly by the building code or the zoning code. So while they're not necessarily written into the building code or the zoning code, they are referenced into it. So those would also be kind of specialty codes, and you have to meet those codes as well as the regular building codes and the zoning codes. All right, so there's all these different sort of code compliance issues. When are you going to be thinking about these things? What's the process of thinking about code compliance? And the answer, of course, is going to be, well, from the beginning. You start with the idea of code compliance in the same way that you start with the idea of a budget and a project delivery method. There's sort of these basic issues that you start at the beginning with, because there's not really a lot of point in starting down a road and designing a building that's not going to be code compliant. It doesn't really help anybody. You're just wasting time, you're spinning your wheels. So it's going to be one of those issues that you bring in very, very early. Depends on the type of project. So certain projects are really obvious what the code issues are going to be. Other ones may take a little bit more research to figure out exactly what's going to be going on. Kind of classic example that actually happened to me at one point was we got called into a project at a client that we had worked with, and they wanted to do a daycare center, and they had just that day signed the lease for an existing space in an adaptive reuse building. And we did a quick code search before we got there, and we realized that for that daycare center to be in that space, it actually doesn't work. It didn't meet the code, and they had already signed the lease. And so, like, literally, the minute after we had had the phone call from the client, we hadn't even seen the space yet. We already knew there was a problem, because we immediately went to the zoning code and we immediately went to the building code because something didn't seem right. So when we went to go meet with them, we were able to say, look, first thing, here's the problem. This is not going to be code compliant. So we need to start with the idea that we have to deal with this somehow, and we were able to negotiate and really think about how we could do this in a way that the code officials were happy with and met all the needs of the client. And so it worked out fine in the end, and it's actually kind of a lovely space. But that process, if we hadn't had that conversation right off, it could have been a really big disaster. And that's one of those examples where it's not something that you get to, it's actually built into the initial moment of thinking about the project. How big of a building is it? Where is the circulation system? How are the different spaces separated from each other? What are the materials like? Right? These are sort of basic ideas. You don't necessarily know the details yet. You don't know the exact number of feet for an egress path. But that's not really the point. The point is you have a sort of initial game plan that starts right at the beginning. And how are you going to start to think about how that's going to work? Well, the first thing is you're going to do a code review. So a code review is going to be an actual document, and you're going to go through all of the issues, and those issues are going to be what is our occupancy type? What is the egress situation? What are the important issues for this particular project? If it's a school, it's one thing. If it's an assembly space, it's another. If it's a multifamily house, it's another set of issues. And we would just document what all of those issues are, so that when we later get into the different design moments along the way, the schematic design, design development, those things, we have a document to go back and check against, are we meeting the code compliance? Now we start with this idea of the code review, and then we constantly refer back to it at set milestones to make sure that we're not letting things slide out of code compliance. So that idea of the review, absolutely something that's going to show up on the NCARB exam. There's going to be some spot where you're talking about, well, all right, first thing, what are we doing? Well, one of the first things is we're doing a code review. So we have the information, that we have a benchmark on which to make our sets of decisions. One of the most important things for you to realize is who is responsible. Not always, because it depends on some of the specific situations, but usually it's you. Usually it's the architect, because there isn't really anybody else expected to be super knowledgeable about the code. You're the player, you're the one on the team that has that knowledge, and your role in almost all of the different contracts is to provide the decision making. You're doing the things that are about the idea, and the idea is, how is this thing going to work in order to keep people safe? How is it going to meet the program? How is it going to, what's it going to look like? That idea, part of that is that keeping people safe aspect of it. And so that really falls into your responsibility. So you want to be really careful about what are the codes, how are the codes going to affect the documentation, and what specific pieces of information for that specific project type and that specific project delivery type are you going to put into that code review, so that you can use that as your benchmark as you're going along through the whole project. So now let's take a look at some specific examples.